الإسعافات الأولية من أجل نقل المصابين إلى المشافي المتواجدة في المنطقة.
إسعاف يا شيخ.
معك واحدة زيادة؟
Breaking news out of Syria. We warn all of our viewers here in the United States and around the world. The story and the pictures we're about to tell you about are very graphic. One doctor in Syria says he has never seen anything like this. It's beyond description, this doctor says. He's talking about patients brought into a hospital in the northern province of Idlib after a suspected chemical attack. Aleppo Media Center reports 70 people, including at least 10 children, have been killed. Many, many more have been injured. That same Syrian doctor tells us whole families died of asphyxiation, and 500 wounded covered the floors of an entire hospital, from the patients' rooms to the operating rooms to the hallways. Our senior international correspondent Arwa Damon is joining us now. Arwa, you've been to Idlib several times. Unfortunately, you've seen these kinds of atrocities in Syria. Do you think this reported chemical attack, first of all, is the work of the Syrian regime?
Well, that's what opposition activists are on the ground are saying and reporting. In fact, one local journalist who filmed some of the images that have been put out there told CNN that there were multiple strikes that morning and that he was hiding under a building in a bomb shelter. He also said that when he finally came out, he had trouble breathing. He was speaking with the doctors there. He was coughing very heavily, trying to get out. And of course, filming all of the horrors that were unfolding around him. Now, the Syrian regime is categorically denying any sort of involvement whatsoever, but at this stage, they're really the only entity that has the capacity to carry out these kinds of airstrikes. And if we look at historically what has taken place there, the other large chemical attack that happened in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta back in 2013, that also ultimately was carried out by the government itself.
You know, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, Arwa, has said that the long-term status of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad will be decided by the Syrian people. I want you to listen to what Senator John McCain said this morning in reacting.
Barack Obama said that they would have a red line, they crossed it, and he did nothing. And Bashar Assad and his friends, the Russians, take note of what Americans say. I'm sure they took note of what our Secretary of State said just the other day, that the Syrian people would be determining their own future themselves. That one of the more incredible statements I've ever heard.
So do you think Bashar al-Assad, Arwa, could be emboldened by the Trump administration's statements, most recent statements this past week on Syria?
I think that's a pretty safe assumption to make. As we heard there, the Syrian president was emboldened by the fact that former President Barack Obama's red line was crossed and there was absolutely no accountability, Wolf. And that is pretty mind-boggling given that all of these atrocities, not just these various different alleged chemical attacks, but the indiscriminate bombing of residential areas, of hospitals, of schools that we have been seeing carried out by both the Syrian regime and by the Russians in areas like Aleppo, for example, have been allowed to move forward with absolutely no accountability. And now we have this kind of an attack, and adding to all of that, of course, the statements that the Syrian president may not necessarily have to stand down. But also, Wolf, at the end of the day, the Trump administration does not necessarily hold human rights violations as being an essential factor when it comes to how they're dealing with various different governments. But this certainly sends a very stark and disheartening message. If the United States, of all countries, is going to allow these kinds of actions, these kinds of deaths, these kinds of acts of sheer and utter incomprehensible violence to go forward, then what has happened to the humanity that America is meant to be upholding? What has happened to America's moral high ground?
Arwa Damon joining us from New York. She spent a lot of time in Syria over these past several years. Arwa, thank you very much.
And decided what it would do, and it was actually voted on unanimously. And the joint mechanism came back and said that the Syrian government committed chemical weapons acts against their own people 3 different times. But somehow now we don't like what the joint investigative mechanism does. Having said that, I will say in the life of the United Nations, there are times when we are compelled to do more than just talk. There are times we are compelled to take collective action. This Security Council thinks of itself as a defender of peace, security, and human rights. We will not deserve that description if we do not rise to action today. Yesterday morning, we awoke to pictures, to children foaming at the mouth, suffering convulsions, being carried in the arms of desperate parents. We saw rows of lifeless bodies, some still in diapers, some with visible scars of a chemical weapons attack. Look at those pictures. We cannot close our eyes to those pictures. We cannot close our minds of the responsibility to act. We don't yet know everything about yesterday's attack, but there are many things we do know. We know that yesterday's attack bears all the hallmarks of the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons. We know that Assad had used these weapons against the Syrian people before. That was confirmed by this council's own independent team of investigators. We know that yesterday's attack was a new low, even for the barbaric Assad regime. Evidence reported from the scene indicates that Assad is now using even more lethal chemical agents than he did before. The gas that fell out of the sky yesterday was more deadly, leaving men, women, the elderly, and children gasping for their very last breath. And as first responders, doctors, and nurses rushed to help the victims, a second round of bombs rained down. They died in the same slow, horrendous manner as the civilians they were trying to save. We all also know this. Just a few weeks ago, this council attempted to hold Assad accountable for suffocating his own people to death with toxic chemicals. Russia stood in the way of this accountability. They made an unconscionable choice. They chose to close their eyes to the barbarity. They defied the conscience of the world. Russia cannot escape responsibility for this. In fact, if Russia had been fulfilling its responsibility, there would not even be any chemical weapons left for the Syrian regime to use. There is one more thing we know. We know that if nothing is done, these attacks will continue. Assad has no incentive to stop using chemical weapons as long as Russia continues to protect his regime from consequences. I implore my colleagues to take a hard look at their words in this council. We regularly repeat tired talking points in support of a peace process that is regularly undermined by the Assad regime. Time and time again, Russia uses the same false narrative to deflect attention from their allies in Damascus. Time and time again, without any factual basis, Russia attempts to place blame on others. There is an obvious truth here that must be spoken. The truth is that Assad, Russia, and Iran have no interest in peace. The illegitimate Syrian government, led by a man with no conscience, has committed untold atrocities against his people for more than 6 years. Assad has made it clear that he doesn't want to take part in a meaningful political process. Iran has reinforced Assad's military, and Russia has shielded Assad from UN sanctions. If Russia has the influence in Syria that it claims to have, we need to see them use it. We need to see them put an end to these horrific acts. How many more children have to die before Russia cares? The United States sees yesterday's attack as a disgrace at the highest level, an assurance that humanity means nothing to the Syrian government. The question members of this council must ask themselves is this: if we are not able to enforce resolutions preventing the use of chemical weapons, what does that say for our chances of ending the broader conflict in Syria? What does that say of our ability to bring relief to the Syrian people? If we are not able to enforce resolutions preventing the use of chemical weapons, what does that say about our effectiveness in this institution? If we are not prepared to act, then this council will keep meeting month after month to express outrage at the continuing use of chemical weapons, and it will not end. We will see more conflict in Syria. We will see more pictures that we can never unsee. I began my remarks by saying that in the life of the United Nations, there are times when we are compelled to take collective action. I will now add this: when the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action. For the sake of the victims, I hope the rest of the council is finally willing to do the same. The world needs to see the use of chemical weapons and the fact that they will not be tolerated. Thank you.
All right, you're listening right there to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. A passionate, powerful statement coming from her. Let's discuss this, what this means, what she said.
По данным российских средств объективного контроля воздушного пространства, вчера в период с 11:30 до 12:30 местного времени сирийская авиация нанесла удар в районе восточной окраины населенного пункта Хан-Шейхун по крупному складу боеприпасов террористов и скоплению военной техники. На территории этого склада находились цеха по производству фугасов, начиняемых отравляющими веществами. С этого крупнейшего арсенала боеприпасы с химоружием доставлялись боевиками на территорию Ирака. Их применение террористами было неоднократно доказано как международными организациями, так и официальными властями этой страны. Данные боеприпасы с отравляющими веществами также использовались боевиками в сирийском Алеппо, когда их применение было зафиксировано в конце прошлого года российскими военными специалистами. Симптомы пострадавших от отравления в Хан-Шейхуне на видеокадрах в соцсетях точно такие, как были осенью прошлого года у пострадавших в городе Алеппо. Тогда все факты применения химоружия в Сирии вместе с пробами грунта были запротоколированы и переданы в Организацию по запрещению химического оружия. Однако эксперты этой международной организации, получив все материалы и пробы, доказывающие применение террористами отравляющих веществ в Сирии, до сих пор их изучают. Мы утверждаем, что приведенная информация является полностью объективной и достоверной.
For more on the gas attack in Syria, we're being joined now by Michael Maloof, former senior security policy analyst at the Pentagon. Mike, good to see you back-to-back days now. The Syrian government is vehemently denying bombing civilians with the chemical weapons. They don't, however, deny bombing the Khan Shaykhun area of Idlib. Lizzie Phelan, you just saw in her report there, they found chemical weapons, a weapons hideout, rather. Is it possible that it was the chemical weapons hideout, like that one that we saw in the story, that was bombed, and it was those chemicals that perhaps got out into the air?
More than likely. Both the Syrian government and the Russian government have vehemently denied that they used anything of that sort. And I think that the Russians are particularly watchful of that because of the international reaction.
Right.
And if you'll recall, the Russians actually forced the Syrians to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention as a result, when they and get rid of their stockpiles. Their stockpiles.
Yeah.
So it's quite. Now you got to consider the area, Idlib. Idlib is the last area in the western part of Syria where you have the rebels that have come together. It's not very far from the Turkish border. Sarin was used. There was sarin that was used in this attack, and it's quite conceivable that they hit an area where there was a storage of this sarin. Sarin has been the intelligence community, even in the U.S., has determined that these rebels had the capability to produce sarin. They got that capability from the Iraqis, from the Sunnis, the radical Sunnis that had been assisting ISIS. The route was from Iraq to Turkey into Idlib area.
Now, nobody, like you said, nobody's claiming responsibility for this sarin attack, alleged sarin attack anyway, just yet. But tell me, who stands to gain the most? I mean, I don't know how else to frame it. Who else stands to gain the most from committing such a crime?
Oh, nobody. Nobody.
But politically?
Politically, it's a no-win situation because immediately everyone's going to cast aspersions on the Syrians. They're going to cast aspersions on the Russians, and there's mounting evidence to show that it would not be in their interest to do that. On the other hand, having the storage there, and as your film just showed, they found storages of it. That says a lot. The other thing is that National Security Council now is supposed to hold an emergency meeting on this. Yet you have Western powers whose interest it is to blame Assad and the Russians immediately are also going to be meeting to discuss this and to try and get the facts.
Because there are stories out there right now today floating out there in Arabic press saying that this is basically a double cross by anti-Assad rebels, that they're behind this and essentially framing the Syrian government.
They've done this in the past.
And Russia. I mean, does that have any legs?
It can, because they've done it before. In fact, rebels actually gassed Syrian troops a few years ago, and the UN reported it. There's a record of that. So it's known that they have that capability. And now and it's just possible that they not only hit a storage area, but they could have released some of the gas on the ground at the time of the bombing to make it look like it came from an air attack. Yeah.
So for all we know, it could be that kind of double cross.
But we got to get the facts first. And that's what the UN Security Council is all about.
Let's wait for the facts. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Michael Maloof.
Boker Tov, Chavrim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. Several stories breaking this morning. 6.1 magnitude earthquake strikes over near Iran, actually, to the east part of Iran. Sarin gas, again, in the media all over the world, accusing Syria once again of the horrendous crimes of using sarin gas on civilian populations. Well, it looks like to us that it's back again, foreign powers trying to frame Syria for another deadly gas attack. That's something that Bashar al-Assad is once again not guilty of. Last time, Eren Erdem of the Turkish government, a former parliament member inside of Turkey, and from what I was told recently is still a parliament member of Turkey, had the sufficient evidence that was able to prove that the Turkish government was well aware of the smuggling of the sarin gas inside of Syria and was used against the civilian population in the area of the rebel groups there in order to blame it on President Bashar al-Assad and to justify boots on the ground. Now, we reported just the other day that in Beirut, Lebanon, the United States has already landed 2 huge ships there. They're now moored right there at Beirut, Lebanon, ready to unload all this desert camo military equipment for a possible invasion into Syria. Also, Israel doing a lot of exercises up in the Golan right now. Is it a possibility that there's going to be an invasion into Damascus? And of course, we know President Donald Trump is believing the media propaganda that indeed Bashar al-Assad is using chemical weapons on his own people. But as it was before, there's already the evidence that has come out that has clearly identified that this famed White Helmets group and others are clearly in the know about the attack before it happened, and that it wasn't Bashar al-Assad's government from the beginning. Let's take a look at the evidence that we have. Reuters reporting here on their own news, as many others, CNN and others that are already joined into the campaign. Scores reported killed in gas attack on Syria rebel area. Well, that makes it look more believable if you do it on the rebel-held area, of course, right? And they show all the images of the children. That's the main ones they want to show. Interesting, they don't want to show all the adults. They just focus mainly on children. That's to appeal to the hearts and minds of the American public and the European public to get them to in agreement to go to war against Bashar al-Assad. And of course, it is a tragedy for the children, but what's more of a tragedy is when you know for propaganda purposes you do this type of action in order to justify a war against a government that never did it in the first place. That is the most hideous crime of all. Anyway, a suspected Syrian government chemical attack killed scores of people, including children, in the northwest province of Idlib on Tuesday. A monitoring group, medics and rescue workers in the rebel-held area said. Notice again, it is medics and rescue workers. Of course, that happens to be none other than the White Helmets. All right, so just hold that thought in mind there. Now, at the same time, rebel warehouse with chemical weapons hit by Syrian airstrike in Idlib, Russian MOD states that there. This is on RT News, and it states here the Syrian Air Force has destroyed a warehouse in Idlib province where chemical weapons were being produced and stockpiled before being shipped to Iraq. Russia Defense Ministry spokesman said the strike, which was launched mid-Tuesday, targeted a major rebel ammunition depot east of the town of Khan Shikon. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Major General Igor Karashkanov said in a statement there. Now, that again, another evidence there that the rebels are the ones that are producing these. And of course, we cannot forget Seymour Hersh, who also stated that Hillary Clinton approved the sending of Libya's sarin gas to the Syrian rebels. So this was evidence that was brought out by the British journalist Seymour Hersh that the Obama administration, of course, had falsely blamed the Syrian government. He was one of the many journalists that also recognized that this was all a fabrication. RT News had brought out Eren Erdem, the Turkish parliament member there, who had spoken before the parliament, long before it ever became public, about the knowledge, the well-documented knowledge of the Turkish government, knowing that ISIS was smuggling in the weapons of Syrian gas, the abilities to be able to make it, and that this had been gotten from, as he quoted, from European partners, and that the United States did it the United States only was turning a blind eye while those weapons were being smuggled into the country. So this clearly there's been a trail proven that it has nothing to do with President Bashar al-Assad, but we really want to give a congratulations to Partisan Girl on Twitter. She is a Syrian resident and has been covering many of these false flag events. Not so much that it's a false flag, it's a real Syrian gas attack, but uncovering exactly what they are doing in order to make it look like the real deal. Now what she's done, brought out several things here. Says here, the horrifying thing is the white helmets and Orient News would have had to poison kids to film the fake chemical weapons stories. One thing she said. Now this is what she's bringing out here. Let me just kind of click on this so you can see this a little bit better here. No, it might be better if we don't click on it because we already have it blown up. In the article here, it states right here, tomorrow's, and she's quoting a guy, you'll see his name in a minute because there's another clip where you can actually see who the guy was. Tomorrow, starting a media campaign to cover the density of air raids on rural Hama and use chlorine poison against civilians. Now, this was being stated by a guy on Twitter inside of Syria that they were already planning such an attack there. Now, we'll just kind of follow what she does here. And again, it's the same one there stating there that they were planning on doing this. And she says here, tomorrow we're going to, she quotes it again, tomorrow we're going to create a media story about a chlorine gas attack, later changed to sarin, even though the Syrian government no longer has it, she states there. This here is a picture here. Of course, this is how we know it's the white helmets were involved with it, because they show the white helmets. This is from Paul Antonopoulos, my article on what does not add up in the Idlib chemical weapons attack. And this is what he notes here. And what he brings out in his own article is the experts that show clearly that the white helmets are not using protective gear. Now, what's ironic about this is they were issued 1 month before the attack. They were issued the gear to be able to protect themselves from the sarin gas, but when they're recording the video, they're not using the suits to make the video. Now, that was one of their first mistakes, because you can die from just touching a victim of this, and they're using their bare hands. They got the mask on, but they weren't thinking about putting on the suits before they actually put on the video itself. Now, this is one of the doctors there. He says, this is the latest from the sarin attacks. Patients are still flooding in. This child's been rushed in without any family. They're probably dead. That's his statement. Our hospital is getting full from the sarin attack today. Anyone that wants evidence, I will video call you. All right? Just to set up the propaganda. Patients, as he said, are flooding in, yet this doctor seems to be the main source of gas attack, has time to film, tweet, and video calls. Interesting, isn't it? Let's see. And now they say they blame Britain behind the U.S. position on Assad. UK funds the white helmets. Jihadist rebels kidnap civilians before fleeing village in northern Hama. That's another issue that she was bringing out. The jihadist rebels of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and al-Jayesh al-Iza kidnapped the inhabitants of Khattab in the north. 250 civilians kidnapped by al-Qaeda 1 week before the chemical attack. So they are believing that these civilians that were kidnapped were actually being used to make the video. Now she's going to bring out a very good point on that, and I'm going to show you that here in just a moment. It's very sad, very disheartening to see this. I do warn you before we go up to some of this evidence that Partisan Girl is going to show here. It is graphic, it is children, but I think it's important that we bring this out for the purpose of what she is trying to show here. And that is, some of the children in the chemical weapons attack appear to have been bludgeoned to death, not dying from the chemical attacks. All these children here have blunt force trauma to their heads. And I'll go off that quickly because I don't want you to have to see that there. Again, another angle of the fire hose location seems to be a White Helmets base with hideouts dug into the rocks, they're pointing out. And of course, these are supposed to all be victims, and yet they're not using any protective gear at all to try to hose the people off, which is only would have contaminated them worse if this was really the case here. They took the gas mask. They've been paving the road in the last days. We are sure it was a coincidence, is what one person says about it as well. The point is, and there's several more on here. Let me back up here. Let's see here. Yeah, here was the thing that she was pointing out right here. This is, while making the fake video, the White Helmets didn't realize Saren's first responders need full body suits as it will kill via skin contact. All right, now this is to show you this is exactly what they're supposed to be wearing, and they were issued this only a month before the attack was to take place. In fact, the other thing that Partisan Girl points out on a lot of these issues here is that almost everyone were getting masked the day before the attack. All the rebels, they were all getting masked the day before the attack. So they were prepared for this coming to be coming. Now, this is what one expert actually said in response to the way this was being done. He says, organic phosphates can spread by simple contact or inhalation. In its gas form, it would persist for the same time as it takes water to evaporate. There's no real evidence of patients being decontaminated in the way that we would consider appropriate decontamination, yet none of the treating or transporting personnel are wearing any protective gear at all. If treating personnel were not wearing protective gear and were exposed to weapons-grade organic phosphate, we would expect them to be injured in some way, says Caldicott. We know the phenomena of off-gassing, which is the delivery of dangerous products in the environment by contaminated patients. It is not that important to use the emergency department for simple insecticide poisoning, that is. So this is chemical grade, weapons grade, and so therefore, as he's basically to surmise that, is just definitely not realistic what we're seeing there. Let's see, we have here, this is where they were actually given the protective suiting. Again, you can see where the White Helmets are right by the cave there where they were doing the spray off there. The photo was taken more than a month ago. The White Helmet terrorists receiving a training on dealing with chemical attacks in the same location where they're actually working with the people. And this would have been the suits they should have been wearing when they were doing the video. I guess they just forgot about that important aspect that figured nobody would actually put two and two together. So let's see if I know she had several other things on there. Of course, she had Seymour's article on there as well. And, you know, again, I think the most important and the most chilling evidence that Partisan Girl had shared was the fact that one man in particular actually spoke about that they were going to do this drill the day before it actually happened. Right here is where it's at. Tomorrow we are going to create a media story about chlorine gas attack. And it was the very, from what I understand, it was the next day or something of that accord there that the sarin gas took place. He called it chlorine gas, but maybe he just didn't realize that they were going to use sarin gas instead. Like I said, tremendous amount of evidence that this young lady has put together, and that just being from her own work there, that clearly identifies or seems to help prove the fact that it was not the Assad government dealing with this attack on his own people, but in fact the rebels in behind a massive propaganda campaign once again, and unfortunately using real civilians as their own guinea pigs. What a shame indeed.